Okay, I'm going to title this section Altitudes, as you'll see there. And it's going to be going back and reviewing a lot of these things you probably had back in your general and airframe classes. But I traditionally know that you've probably forgotten a lot of it. Also, these are important to us where you might have just been kind of learning what they were when you were back in general and airframe. But you'll find if you get out in the industry, if you're working in these type of aircraft, the smaller aircraft, the single engines and twin engines and so on, at some point, maintenance-wise, you'll find that you maybe have installed an engine or you have installed a turbocharger, and so whether the engine's naturally aspirated, there's some things you'll be checking like static RPMs and things like that. And we'll talk about those in just a second. Or if it's a turbocharged or mechanically aspirated engine, we quite often have to do a flight test. And some of those altitude terms are important to us because you'll get yourself a pilot, and he'll have all his pilot things he needs for operating the aircraft. And then you'll have your maintenance manual or instructions for continued airworthiness you're utilizing to do these engine setup and test procedures. So we're going to talk a little bit about true altitude. We're going to talk about absolute altitude, indicated altitude, pressure, density, critical altitude, service ceiling, and of course static RPM, as I just mentioned. So these are all terms, and some are of course a little more important, but we'll review all those just so that you can recall what some of those are. I think the one I'll do first is I'll address critical altitude. So I picked up a type certificate data sheet that's for our 402, and out here because a lot of you have been working on the 402 stuff. So when I look at and this is an airframe type certificate data sheet for the 402. But it does tell us that we've got a TSIL 520E engine in it. And then what I've got, if it's too small to see on your screen, I'll just read this. For all operations, at 2,700 RPM, you're developing 300 horsepower, and you'll have a 34.5 inches of mercury manifold air pressure, up to a critical altitude of 16,000 feet in standard atmosphere. Okay? So what this is saying is when I have a mechanically aspirated engine, TSIO 520, that this thing can deliver 300 horsepower up to its critical altitude. So critical altitude is the highest altitude that an engine can deliver its rated horsepower. Okay? And then, once you go above critical altitude, that horsepower has to start dropping off. And part of the reason for that is, it's pretty amazing on this turbocharger, even though as you go up in altitude, the outside air is getting colder and colder, because this does have to work harder and harder. So as you were going up in altitude, the wastegate, which is controlling how much air does not go into or goes through the turbine, the wastegate eventually gets where it's almost completely, or would be probably completely closed, depending on conditions, and makes this work harder and harder. So as you go up in altitude, in fact, there's one fact that I know at certain altitude where the outside air temperature is coming in here is 2 degrees, and you've compressed that air back up to that 34.5 inches, it now could be 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty impressive how much of a temperature-wise the air goes up by just compressing it. So usually critical altitude is established because your air going into the cylinders is getting too warm. And of course, the warmer it gets, and of course we're really pressurizing it there, you would be operating closer and closer to possible detonation. So that's why typically critical altitude is usually not a fact that the turbocharger can't do it, The turbocharger could do it. It's just that air. So it's kind of interesting how you, as you go up in altitude, you find yourself turning your cabin heater on a little more, and so cabin heat's going up and up, and turn that back off for a second. As you're going up in altitude, the outside air, you find you're putting jackets on inside the airplane because maybe the heater can't keep up, it's getting quite cold outside. But yet you look down at that CHT, the cylinder head temperature gauge, and you'll see it going up and up and up. So even though the outside, the OAT gauge, the outside air temperature gauge is heading down, and you're getting, you can feel that cool air, now you start feeling all the little leaks in the airplane. And then you see that CHT. And so typically when that CHT is getting right up near that red line, that's probably going to be where that critical altitude is. And so that's typically why then they do establish that critical altitude. The highest altitude the aircraft can go and still deliver its rated horsepower. One more thing I wanted to review while I had that type certificate data sheet, and so I don't forget about it. When you guys are taking an oral and practical, one of the things you're supposed to perform or identify is a minor alteration. So we talked about, and you've had those terms, major repair or major alterations, and of course then you got those equal signs that go off in your brain with a AI or a repair station or 337 form, so you got major repair. But a minor alteration, you're supposed to identify on your oral and practical a minor alteration. So looking at this airframe type certificate data sheet, down here it talks about for the propeller system. In fact, that's what it is. It's in the propeller part of the test. It says identify a propeller system minor alteration. So on here it says you can have a hydraulic governor, this Woodward part number blah blah blah, and then you see the word down there, or you can have this part number Macaulay governor. So swapping from that Woodward governor over to the Macaulay, and because it is listed on the types of data sheet as a or, you can have this one or that one, swapping to that Macaulay governor would be that minor alteration to a propeller system. So I'll come back and revisit the examiners want to make sure that we cover that, as we review some of these things sometimes. So anyway, that would be one example of a minor alteration to a propeller system. Okay, we'll turn that guy off and get you moved over to here. Okay, so I rattled off quite a few different altitudes there, so I'll just kind of list those up here. So we've got what we call true altitude. We've got absolute. We've got indicated. We've got pressure. So you might recall some of these from your airframe and general classes when you talked about them. We've got density. And we've got, as we just talked about, critical. So we know critical's highest altitude the engine can go to and still deliver its rated horsepower. Then we mentioned the term service ceiling and static RPM. We want to talk about those guys again. Okay, so the ones that are important in this discussion I want to talk about mainly is our pressure altitude, density altitude, and indicated. So I'll just very quickly, true altitude is the height above mean sea level. And so just for a little bit of review there, absolute altitude, that is the actual measured from a radar altimeter above the ground. And so yeah, that's absolute altitude. So now the one we work with a lot, of course, is your indicated altitude. And that, of course, is where you've got your altimeter. And we'll talk about what we're going to do with that in just a second. And then, so, in fact, let's diagram that out a little bit. So, indicated, so here is, say, let's say down here is the sea level, okay? And then let's go up here about, 540 feet. And we've got good old Clover Park here. Okay, so Clover Park, or the Pierce County Airport out here, is 540 feet above sea level. Okay, so when I go to fly the airplane, well, actually I can fly because I'm a pilot as well as being a mechanic, but typically, as I mentioned, when you get ready to do some of these adjustments, you'll get yourself that pilot, but when you get in the airplane, and you, of course, got all your maintenance stuff. So initially the pilot, he's going to dial in indicated altitude because it's indicating how high we are going to be above the ground, or above sea level, excuse me. So an altimeter, indicated altitude, is how high we are above sea level. I might have said that wrong over on the absolute, on the radar altimeter, but anyway, so let's go over here. We'll dial in 540 feet, and yeah, so what we're saying today is that the pressure down at sea level today is 30.04, okay? And so the altimeter, of course, works off of that. That's what, you're kind of calibrating it in a sense here. So we've got 540 feet. If you were to call some sort of a control tower, quite often they rattle off those pressures for that day, which you can also adjust your altimeter. Especially if you're flying along on a long cross country, you can you'll get those flight following and air pressure settings to make sure your altimeter is, because there's an old saying when flying an aircraft that pilots learn, when flying from a high to a low, that would be flying from a high pressure to a low pressure. It says from flying from a high to a low, look out below, because your altimeter, if that pressure at sea level was dropping down and you're trying to stay at 540 feet, the altimeter would be heading down and getting you closer and closer to the ground, even though you believe you're at a higher altitude. Flying from a high to a low, look out below. Okay, so that's what indicated altitude is how high you are above sea level, which then you can figure out how high you're above the ground. So, for instance, when pattern altitude out here at the airport is typically 1,000 feet above the ground, so then I would be flying with my altimeter at 1,540 feet, knowing that I'm 1,000 feet above the ground. So that's indicating basically, though, how high I am above sea level. Okay, the next one that's important is pressure altitude. The question is, what is pressure altitude? So on a standard day, and it's 15 degrees or 59 degrees Fahrenheit, on a standard day with that temperature, and the 29.92 line would be at sea level. That's what a standard day is. Okay? So on this particular day, though, if 3004 is down here, that means 29.92 is up here somewhere, because we know as you go up in altitude, the pressure drops off. Okay, so pressure altitude is how high we are above the 2992 line. Okay, so one of the things when testing out turbocharger systems, in your maintenance instructions that you'll have over in your lap, and so after the pilot has safely cleared all his ground obstacles and stuff, which of course the altimeter was dialed in on indicated altitude, he then will want you to dial in pressure altitude. So I take a look in my, if you guys all remember, that's called the Colesman window. I will simply reach over and dial that guy to 29.92. 2. And so now you'll notice my at pressure altitude here at Pierce County Airport is 440 feet. So we're basically, when I dial in the pressure altitude, there's about 100-foot difference today, difference between the indicated and pressure altitude. Okay, so once again, indicated altitude is how high you are above sea level. Pressure altitude is how high you are above the 29.92 line. And then in your instructions, quite up for like what if one airplane I did one time, a Turbo Arrow, the Turbo Arrow said that I had to take the aircraft initially up to a density altitude of 8,000 feet for my first checks I had to do. And so it was kind of a little story with that. When I got in the airplane with the pilot, he says, so what's the first thing we're doing on this check today? And he says, well, after we get clear of all ground obstacles, we're then going to go up to a density altitude of 8,000 feet. And then the pilot looked at me and says, well, how high is that going to be? And I says, you're the pilot. You're supposed to know that. Anyway, so what he needed was his E6B. And so this is it's kind of like a little calculator, if you will, that because what density altitude, he would input what the outside air temperature is. And so when you're in the airplane, you fly up to a certain altitude, you would look at your outside air temperature, and then you would dial in, or you would put in here what your pressure altitude is, and then this thing will tell you what your density altitude is on that guy. So pilots all learn how to run that. So you as the mechanic don't have to know how, that's his job. So you can figure that. Sometimes, though, you will have, in your maintenance manual, there'll also be some charts for coming up with your density altitude. So density altitude is your pressure altitude with temperature factored in. So like I said, you'll be looking at you've dialed in 29.902, so you get up there, and so I say I've taken it up to, so it's nice on a standard day, you would take it up to the 8,000 indicated on here, or excuse me, that's pressure, in 8,000 pressure altitude, how high you are above the 2992 line, and then you would look at that outside air temperature gauge, and then of course crisscross those factors to come up with your, what is the density altitude. So as an example, here at Thun Field, or Pierce County Airport, even though it's 540 feet above sea level, if it's a 90-degree day out there, that might be the equivalent of having a density altitude of a couple of thousand feet. So, and of course, aircraft perform to density altitude. It affects the horsepower out of the engine if your density is way up, or way down there, I should say. It affects your propeller performance, affects the lift on the wings, and so aircraft perform according to density altitude. Okay, we hit critical altitude already. Oh, one more thing I did want to review, talking about the mechanically aspirated engines. Remember we talked a little bit about manifold air pressure. And so your basic induction system, you got your air filter coming in initially to your compressor, of course, which is directly shafted over to your turbine, which is where exhaust gases are driving that. Then right coming off what's called compressor discharge air, or commonly called upper deck. Sometimes we have to read that when doing some engine setups and pressures. And then, of course, what controls how much manifold air pressure we're letting into the engine is the throttle valve. So this could be a carburetor that's sitting here, or this throttle valve could just be sitting in the induction system all by itself there. Then it's got some sort of control arm that goes over to your fuel injection equipment. Might be sitting here determining, because remember, it's how much air we let in the engine, and then it's the job of the fuel metering device, whether it be a carburetor or fuel injection, that matches the proper amount of fuel to the amount of air going in the engine. Also, we talked about how there's that possibility of it being 160 degrees coming off this compressor. So this is where the thing called an intercooler would sit in here. Whoop, let's do it this way, because on the test questions now, they call that an aftercooler. So in that new book that the Department of Transportation put out, they decided to label that an aftercoat. So I guess technically that's more because it is cooling this upper deck air after it's gotten hot coming off the compressor. But for many years, that's been called an intercooler. You see it advertised on the back of cars and things like that as well, too. Okay, the term service ceiling is how high the aircraft can go to, how high that, because some of these aircraft, you take them up too high. I had a customer one time, he says, well, I took the aircraft up above 30,000 feet, then the ailerons started freezing up. And then also the big one too is like, how well is your heater going to work inside the aircraft? So those are a couple things to think about there. Okay. Static RPM, last one I wanted to address on there. Static RPM applies to a fixed pitch propeller. So a little bit ago when we were looking at that type certificate data sheet for the 402, it of course has where the propeller blades can move around, which they typically will call a constant speed prop, because it's got that governor that's maintaining the RPM and controlling blade pitch on there. And so when you look at that, you'll notice there was no static RPM listed, because typically those governors will allow the engine to run right on up, right from sitting still, and you go full up. But in fact, even as you get coming up on the throttle, about 3/4 of the way up, quite often you will have hit your maximum RPM at 2,700, where the governor will start limiting that RPM at 2,700. But when you have a fixed pitch prop, like on your typical 172s and those sort of things, they list a static RPM, depending on what propeller you have on there, and it'll be expressed as like a 172 N model that we have out here. That will say not under 2280 and not over 2400. So when you're in the aircraft, and you guys will do this out on the run stands too, when you run the engines up to your full products that you got a naturally aspirated engine, then it should give you that static RPM. If it's too low, then of course your engine's not producing, something's wrong, your engine's not producing the proper amount of horsepower. Or if it's too high, perhaps something's wrong, the blade pitch on the prop's wrong, something's off. So that's actually required after you complete a 100-hour annual inspection on an aircraft, that you take the aircraft out, run it up, and that's one of the things you do check is static RPM. One thing I might mention, last thing, was, so we got our mechanically aspirated engines that list that critical altitude, and of course when you look at a naturally aspirated engine's type certificate data sheet, you will not see any kind of maximum altitude, critical altitude listed, because basically once that aircraft leaves, or that engine leaves sea level, hopefully it's dragging the rest of the aircraft along with it, leaves sea level, you no longer are producing your rated horsepower. So those naturally aspirated engines, they only produce their rated horsepower standard A at sea level. Anything above that, then it's a loss of horsepower. Okay, that wraps up our section on all those altitudes of true altitude, absolute, indicated, pressure, density, critical, and of course service ceiling, static RPM. Okay.